So welcome then to the final session, panel session, which I'm very conscious that you've listened to an awful lot today. So I want this one very much more, to be more participative, interactive, discursive, etc. So you'll be really welcome to sort of join in the discussion, because the panellists here are really just going to kind of get the discussion started in various ways. So I'll just begin by introducing them. I won't make a real meal of it because it's all on the handout. Claire Chambers, I'm delighted to welcome, is a senior lecturer in philosophy at and fellow of Jesus College at the University of Cambridge. Lynne Harne is a very long-standing lesbian feminist activist. She's an author, editor of All the Rage, absolutely brilliant book. Who's next? Jodie Woodward, to my right, is a lesbian feminist activist and a senior manager within NIA, a women's sector organisation. She's got extensive experience in violence against women and homelessness. And then finally, at the end here, Angela Gbemisola is a political artist, a lesbian feminist activist and a mother. So welcome to I'm going to begin. Panelists on the whole aren't going to be kind of talking at you, but more talking with you. So I really wanted to begin with Claire, because Claire, I remember a real... God, it's such a memorable day. I kind of like, it was a real beacon of hope for me when you organised the conference in Oxford 1 year after Andrea Dworkin died, the commemorative conference there. Just out of interest, who was at that conference? Oh gosh, that's Julie was. Yeah, Julie was, and she was probably having a fag and outside somewhere. Are the recordings still online? They were up.
They are on my website. I actually just tried to look at them just now and couldn't find them, so I'm going to go back to my
office
and check.
Get that sorted out.
They certainly.
And the transcripts. You did such a great job of recording.
I didn't do the transcripts, someone else did, but yeah, the recordings should be on my website, which is clairechambers.com. So
okay, so
I couldn't get them on. It might be on my iPad, doesn't see them, but if not, I'll put them back on.
So I must say, like when Liz and I were talking about, doing something this year for the 10-year anniversary, your conference really inspired me to actually, galvanise myself and make this happen. So what I'd really like to ask you is, obviously at the time you were at Oxford, thoroughly, uber sort of patriarchal, very traditional history there. What motivated you to organise that conference? How was your experience of doing it, and what do you feel that it achieved, or just your reflections on that experience?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I've been trying to think when I first encountered the work of Andrea Dworkin, and I can't actually remember exactly when it was, but I certainly remember that when I was writing my PhD, I was really trying to get to grips with her work, particularly her work in intercourse. And I was finding it really, really hard to read, in the way that all good philosophy and good theory is hard to read, right? Hard to make sure that I was understanding it properly, difficult to make sure that I had actually fully followed the argument and had it all in place. I remember kind of struggling with this material, finding it both compelling, but also really, provocative, again in a really good way. I was finding it challenging, and trying to work out that I properly understood it, and finding there really wasn't much help with doing that from the academic context. I wasn't aware of much academic discussion or work on her writing, and so I struggled with that for a bit during my PhD, and then didn't actually end up using any of that work in the final PhD, which is what became the book that we kindly mentioned. So then, after I had got my PhD, I had this postdoctoral position in Oxford, and I thought what would be fantastic would be to have a conference on Andrea Dworkin, and I had in mind really an academic sort of conference where we could do what academic conferences do, namely to take the work and discuss it, pros and cons, for and against, does it mean this, does it mean that? I was just a traditional academic conference, that's what I had in mind. And so I thought it would be great to have sessions on different aspects of her work with feminists and theorists and philosophers who were very much in favour of her analysis and those who were critical, and just have an academic discussion. And what I found actually was that it was very difficult to find academics who were willing to speak at that conference. Particularly, it was mainly UK based, I was looking for because of funding. Because there was quite a lot of fear actually expressed. There were quite a lot of women, feminists, who said, well, I'm not sure I agree with her work, and so I don't think I should come and talk at this conference. And so that was quite interesting to me to find that there was this sense of a reluctance amongst some academic feminists to engage with that work that they found obviously really challenging and difficult. And then the other thing that surprised me was the huge enthusiasm about Andrea Dworkin's work that I received from women around the world. So I set up this conference, and as I say, it was in the University of Oxford. It was a fairly traditional academic location, but it had some amazing speakers. So Jodie Woodward was one, Catherine McKinnon was one, Jen Stoltenberg, Michael Moore, got some great speakers, Sheila Jeffries. And I had women from around the world emailing me, saying how massively important Andrea Dworkin's work had been to them personally. I had someone write to me from America saying she wasn't going to be able to come because she was in America, but she sent me the kind of £10 registration fee towards the conference. Astonishing things I'd never experienced before. So I found that was a really fascinating thing. And then the experience of the conference itself was so amazing. And one of the things that was amazing to me was, as I said, I had read a great deal of Andrea Dworkin's work and found, all of it extremely powerful, and some of it more powerful than others. And there were bits of the work that I had read and I hadn't really understood what it was saying, what it was about. And I can still really remember really strongly Catherine McKinnon's plenary speech which is the final session. Because one of the things that she did in that speech was that she read many of her favourite excerpts from various parts of the work. And there were a number of times where, hearing Catherine McKinnon speaking this material, I suddenly understood it. And passages that I'd read and just not really got the point of, not thought they were saying much. And I would hear Catherine McKinnon speaking and think, okay, now I understand what Andrea was saying, and now I understand the significance of that. And so that whole experience has led me to realise that when we are reading and teaching her work, we need to do what we are used to doing with, dead white male philosophers, right? We need to help people to read it because it's difficult in the way that excellent theory is difficult. And so now I teach undergraduates and graduates, but I teach a feminism seminar at the university here, and I often get them to read a whole variety of work, and sometimes to get them to read work by Andrea Dworkin. And I still remember one session where I got the group to read a chapter from Intercourse. And this was a group that had been doing feminism in the seminars for a while, and were really kind of committed, and a really fantastic group. And so they came in and I said, okay, so what did everybody think of the reading this week? And I remember one of the students who was definitely a feminist and had been really feminist, said, well, I hated this. I hated it. And she explained why. And and it was clear that a lot of that is to do with the difficulties of reading it and the care you have to take in reading it properly. And what I think is so interesting, and listening to the excerpt that you read earlier, is that a lot of the time she is writing in the voice of patriarchy. She's writing about what patriarchy says, what patriarchy means. And if you read that casually, if you read that the first time, if you read that unsympathetically, you can think that she's saying that herself. That she's saying, women do this, men do this, this is what men were for. And she's talking in the voice of patriarchy. And with this session where we kind of carefully went through this text with my students, and I was able to say, well, here it looks like this, but actually that's, to go through like you would with any other text of philosophy, right? So I think that we as academics need to take this work seriously, and we need to read it carefully, just as we do other works of theory. I think that conferences, speaking, I sometimes play excerpts of Andrea's speeches in lectures, can really help towards that.
Okay, thank you. I just want to sort of pursue this a little bit, because I think it's come up a few times now about some of the difficulties of reading. The first, a few women have said, when I first read it, it didn't really mean that much, I've gone back and read. So I think there is something about the difficult and challenging nature of some of it. But you didn't mention anything around resistance, like the resistance to read it, because I know that's also something, and I don't know, maybe Angela would speak about this a bit later on, But I also think there is something about what is permissible for us to know and what is permissible for us to understand. And, you know, working within, well, I live really from relatively recently, over the last couple of years, working within an academic institution, but it's something that I felt in other institutions. So there are certain forms of knowledge that are not welcome, that they seriously are not welcome, that are pretty much unspeakable. And I think there is, so to me, there is a huge kind of an inevitable, I can't even say tension, but a huge contradiction about bringing Andrea Dworkin's work or other radical feminist work into a patriarchal institution. That there's something about that does feel extremely dangerous, because you know how potentially, if you know some of the students are receptive to it, it's going to be hugely challenging and painful to them. So there's one thing about the kind of intellectual engagement, but what do you think about the sort of, maybe about the politics of universities at the moment, and about the kind of resistance, you know, that young women are having to survive in a world where, you know, it's almost imperative for them to, you know, wear makeup and, you know, fashion, you know, all this kind of stuff. And then reading something like Dworkin on that, it's absolutely mind-blowing. So I don't know, what do you think about those kinds of resistances as well?
I'd like to hear other people's experiences. I mean, it's probably partly to do with the way that we teach in Cambridge and in Oxford, and I've also taught it in London, but I haven't taught this material there. And so in both of those universities, we have a lot of kind of very small group teaching, one-on-one teaching, and small group seminar teaching. So I've actually found it quite easy to teach this material because I've been able to set it for my students and talk about it with them. But I'd be really fascinated to hear experiences from elsewhere in academia about that difficulty. So I found it possible to do it.
And I wonder as well, because there's something about the process and how you can do it and all of that. But then I have to say, this is not personal to you, but like to all of us who are working in, you know, these contexts, how many of our students then go on and live their lives as radical feminists? And actually, if we're not doing that, really, what is the point of just sitting and reading some books and thinking this is all very interesting? So, like, to me, this is probably the massive challenge.
We don't always know the impact of our teaching, actually. So one of the students that I taught very early on in my career in Cambridge is now an academic herself. And I was chatting to her and she said, you know, that course we did really made an impact. And she said there was a huge discussion amongst the students, you know, we were all having these long debates about whether there could be such a thing as ethical pornography and so on. You know, and I wouldn't have known that had been the impact outside the classroom had I not spoken to her. So we don't always know.
We don't always know. Okay, so, yeah, is it behind, so yourself and then Helen and then George?
I mean, when I came across Andrea Dworkin's work, to have someone even criticising heterosexual sex as a tool of power was just completely unthinkable from where I was in that point of feminism. To read something that unknown and that unreferenced before completely changes your outlook, and I think a lot of students see that and they either completely balk and they say, okay, I'm never going to understand any of this is all crazy, paranoid women, or people say, actually, why has no one else criticise this? This is really important. And as a first year, I'm an undergrad student at Birmingham, we did a module on social divisions, and there was a section on gender and sex. And they talked about radical feminism briefly, but it was always under the kind of, there's good feminism and then there's radical feminism. You take it too far and they were all crazy and man-hating and they wrote some really weird things and we just don't talk about them. Like, that was how it was framed. In the reading list, it was like, so there was like maybe one article that was even slightly in that direction.
Thanks, we'll go on to Helen and then
just briefly about what you're saying about the impact of teaching these things. I think it's not something you can really see in an instant. When I think about my own transformation, I guess, I would say it's probably been maybe 6 or 7 years from the first time I read a radical feminist book to like properly embracing it in my life. And I think that, you know, maybe those students, because there are so many barriers as well, like if you don't have that culture around you and you get a lot of backlash from people, it's difficult to fundamentally change your life and it's difficult to fundamentally change your views. But I think it sows the seeds and, you know, women might well go back to that and that might be a cause for a much bigger exploration later in life. So I think it's, you know, good to see it worthwhile in that sense.
Jules.
Well, working in the discipline of criminology as I do, generally, in my experience, doesn't allow or provide a space for us to discuss radical feminism in any depth. It's touched upon as this is a perspective on sexual violence, when I've taught sexual violence or I've taught social construction, but generally speaking, in the institutions I've worked with, the parameters of learning are already in place before I've got there. So what I'm asked to teach on, whether it's talking about sexual violence or domestic violence, then, you know, Jules, you've got to talk about the programs that are in place to treat perpetrators. You've got to talk about the history of the development of those, of the criminal justice responses to it. Talk about feminism, you know, in the usual way, and that gives me my window in. I also wonder if another reason why that happens in that the space isn't there to discuss radical feminism is because it's not on the curriculum, and that fear you were talking about in your introduction, Julia, about it's a bit dangerous to even talk about it. I wonder, is that why it's not there? Because it is this perception of it being dangerous. It's a real shame, really.
I mean, I wonder maybe like Ray and Clary, like obviously you bring Dworkin's work, into philosophy, but it does seem to me that if you look at a lot of the kind of gender study, what used to be women's studies, but now gender studies, I'd say she's pretty much absent from most of those readings. I don't know what other women's experience of that has been, but so I don't know any thoughts on that.
She was mentioned in my feminism and sexuality module. I'm an MA student in the Centre for Women's Studies in the University of York, and she was mentioned in that module. We did talk a bit about radical feminism.
I used to teach a course called Women, Violence and Human Rights up until about 2008, and radical feminism was the main framework in which it was taught, and it was within a criminology programme. And so I can't imagine actually teaching about violence against women within any other framework. And there was, pornography and prostitution section, which even after I left that university where I was teaching it, I was invited back to teach, probably because nobody else thought they could teach it. But that's where Dworkin came in, and obviously other people who've written about pornography and prostitution. So I think, how long ago is that? God, that's 9 years ago now. Have things got that much worse?
I think maybe it also depends on your role in the department.
Yeah.
So my role over the last 12 years has been as a part-time lecturer, more recently as a full-time teaching fellow. So my role isn't as someone who's been there to develop the modules, it's been to deliver the modules.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll take Vicky and then yourself, and then I think we'll go on because I want to move the discussion on a bit while I'm asking some other questions.
I just wonder whether the reason that Andrea Dworkin is so threatening is that it requires so much of the reader, in the fact that I remember reading some of her stuff when I was much younger, and I didn't have the life experience to relate to it, so therefore it didn't really make a lot of sense to me, and so therefore I looked at her stuff and sort of went, this, isn't really very relevant to me, her type of feminism. Later, when I'd experienced male violence and saw people's reactions to me as a victim and the constructs around it, I returned to her work and went, hey, this makes a whole lot more sense. And sometimes I think that in going, you're not ready for it until you're ready for it, because you haven't got anything to relate it to in your own life. And I think that very often is the case when you're possibly much younger, or what have you, maybe not being a mum and stuff like that. You haven't had the experiences, when you're 14, 15, you grow up thinking Disney's real, or that's what it's sort of going to be like, and then gradually.
Because we heard from Betty that that's not the case, right? That young people are very much familiar now with sexualisation and as
Yeah.
well. It's a very familiar thing.
I think it's more relevant now.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was just going to say, I think it just, obviously, I also go back to Julia's point. I do think that a lot of the time, though, that actually women stop reading it or find it difficult actually because it resonates too much.
Yeah.
And I think that when you talk about what it requires of you, I think that also a lot of the time it requires of us to really look at what we're doing in our own lives and view things differently, particularly the stuff in intercourse and around heterosexuality, you know, so much of that. And I think sometimes that can also be the reason why actually women say, oh no, I can't relate to it, but actually I think a lot of the times some of it is resonating, but it's actually too scary to really kind of embrace that. So
I just wanted to say that my background is more in sociology, and I've never been taught about Andrea Dworkin or Catherine McKinnon's work, and it's all through self-reading and through having discussions with myself, reading on the internet and so forth. And I feel as though, to an extent, I've really missed out on engaging in dialogue and discussion in an academic context, because there's no teaching in sociology, there's no feminist legal studies in law. And so what I've tried to do is in the seminars and the supervisions, which I undertake now, is introduce radical feminist theory with my students. And we really thrive, I think, in the diversity of the discussion, particularly as a lot of the teaching is focused on liberal feminist theory. And I've had students who then emailed me subsequently to ask about books to read to develop their theoretical insights into feminism, and it's been really great and really engaging, but I have to say I have struggled with that. As I say, it is self-taught and it's difficult. And within my second year of Viva, I was challenged pretty much just on the basis that I use radical feminist theory, and something that was mentioned earlier, and that it is quite dated, you know, because it's 5 years old, as though it's 10 years old, or it's going back to the 80s, and I have to justify that.
Ray, I'll just take your question and we'll come
It
to
was just a quick follow-up on this. One thing is that, as some people know, philosophy is very short on women in general, but also there's been a lot of contribution, there's been a lot of new work in feminist philosophy recently, and I would say it's becoming mainstreamed in many institutions. That's my own experience, which might be a bit partial or biased, but one thing that's emerging partly about the awareness of women in philosophy generally, and then about feminist philosophy, is that many efforts are going into pooling shared resources, including teaching resources. So Phil Papers, which is this online resource for people's academic work, is also now starting to put out people's proposed, course outlines and so forth, and it's very much part of these projects that people share their teaching materials, and that does not only make available certain sorts of material, including this sort of work we're talking about, but also gives it a kind of credibility and makes people think this is part of our new practice. So that's where I feel, when I'm in my hopeful mood, that we're heading in philosophy, but also in the case of law, it especially integrates, because there's so much good, interesting feminist philosophical work that connects with what's going on in law, and is inspired, in fact, by what's going on in law. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to move the discussion on now. It's been very sort of focused on academia up to this point. So, Lynne, I wanted to ask you if you could say a bit about your involvement with WAVOR back in the early 80s, was it mid-80s?
Yes, early
80s. And the kind of influence of Dworkin at the time, or just what you were all doing, and the development of the campaign against pornography, etc. So to look at that kind of practice outside of an academic conference, but within a kind of activist context.
I mean, I was once an activist before I became an academic.
You're still an activist.
Now I'm an activist again. And I just want to say a bit about the context of the organisation Women Against Violence Against Women, and alongside that, Angry Women, and then following that, Pornography is Violence Against Women, which is how it sort of developed. And really, I mean, just in terms of, it's a bit like now, except now it's very different. We didn't have the internet, of course. So, but from the late 1960s through the 1970s, pornography was becoming mainstreamed, and sex shops were beginning, towards the end of the night, I can't remember exactly when, but sex shops became licensed, and so they could just apply for a license from the local authority, a bit like the lap dancing. And the other thing that happened was that throughout the 70s, somehow, below the counter, under the counter, dirty magazines, as they were called then, came from under the counter and onto the shelf that were visible to everybody. And this was also before the 1982 obscenity laws, which restricted that a bit. But so pornography became absolutely visible and became mainstreamed and was everywhere, and also the development in films and advertising. So just to give you an example, there was an advert which said, and this is something like, because this is from memory, if a car was a woman, you would really like to drive her. And then, of course, we then called ourselves revolutionary feminists, spray painted over that and said if a woman was a car, she would run you over. But those were the sort of adverts that were proliferated around the country. Absolutely proliferation from probably the mid-70s onwards. So that was the context of the beginning of the development of women, the organisation Women Against Violence Against Women, and also at the end of the 1970s there was the Yorkshire Ripper, killing I forget how many women, but and there was also this division made between it doesn't matter because those women are just prostitutes. That was the dialogue and what the media was saying, and that's when we really began to see the interconnections really between also pornography and prostitution, and that pornography is prostitution, and you can't separate the two because what pornography depicts is women in prostitution. So all that was going on, and then but the other thing that was against us was the sort of Mary Whitehouse phenomena. And so as soon as we started to take action, we got called prudes. You couldn't be against sex. You couldn't be against pornography because pornography was sex, basically. So that was the main arguments. And the left, there were magazines like Oz, which Andrea Dworkin wrote about the US equivalent called Suck, which was a left-wing, promoted libertarian left-wing magazine, which was promoting pornography just like Playboy was. But we on the left, you can't possibly organise against pornography because it's a right and a freedom, and so it's being taken up by leftist men. And into that context also, and I don't remember when exactly, Woman Hating, which was Dworkin's first book and was the first thing that began to influence all of us, hit the UK because it was suppressed as a paperback in the States, but it was certainly after probably 1975 or something, and that was the first book I read of Dworkin's. And the first article in that book is about sex roles and fairy tales, and just to read a bit of something that she said, and sort of based on Sleeping Beauty, just as one example. To be a good woman, you have to be beautiful, passive, victimised, and almost dead. That's what the story of Sleeping Beauty is about. And the corollary to that is also that the woman who's good must be possessed. And women who resist that passivity and are active are women who do provoke sexual violence and deserve to be punished, so they deserve to be killed. And I should also say at the same time that I was reading this and that other feminists were reading this, there was what was coming out were the snuff movies, and they were called snuff because of one particular film. But they were movies about women actually being tortured and then killed as a form of pornography and being sold in sex shops. And that all made us so very, very angry, and the proliferation of pornography that happened during the 1970s, and that then wasn't just in magazines but became in mainstream films and videos. One of the films I remember that we protested against was The Shining, which some of you may have heard of, which is all about basically a woman being absolutely terrified by the man who flew over the cuckoo's nest character. Yes, Jack Nicholson, and just connotations of that. And in terms of violence against women, we weren't just publicly protesting, but if you like, Angry Women was the militant feminists, a bit like the militant suffragettes branch of Wavell, and what we were doing is taking direct action against sex shops, and taking direct action against cinemas that was showing these horrendous films about torturing and sexual violence of women, which were mainstream. For example, in cinemas we were putting cement down the cinema toilets so the cinema would be closed down, because you've got to have a toilet. If you're a public facility like a cinema, you've got to have a toilet to use. Sex shops, some of the milder things we did was glue up the locks, which you could do in those days, and of course they weren't protected like they are now, and there weren't CCTV, and of course graffitiing adverts and so on, which again now is very hard to do because of CCTV. But there was actually a wave of anger, and following on from the Ripper murders, there was actually a wave of anger that went across the country. And I think Dworkin's influence, starting from woman hating, where we realised that pornography was just basic misogyny, as well as her making the connections with what had been what was sort of a lot of feminists were against, which was against sex roles and so on. And very early in the feminist movement, women were protesting women's liberation. The first thing women protested about was the way beauty, the standards of beauty that men set up, were confining women, and Dworkin sort of made the connection between the social construction and the ideology that women must be beautiful and the sexual subordination of women. And so that was also a really important aspect of her work, and which very few feminists had done before. She was building on what Kate Millett had done in Sexual Politics, and also Mary Daly in Beyond God the Father, but writing about the way men actually thought about women, and taking first her writings, like men's writings about literary pornography, and then actually taking men's pornographic magazines, and actually because before films it was pornographic writing, and actually saying what was in these, but we weren't probably so much aware about because we didn't see it. And then out of Wavell they became this organisation called Pornography is Violence Against Women, and that had a slideshow And I remember being the first, going to the first Peeble conference and being shown what pornography, the most horrific pornography that existed by then, was the meat grinder photograph, which you may all be familiar with, where you just see a woman's legs and her head is inside a meat grinder, and at the bottom meat is coming out. And going on for there, and that slideshow was taken on round the country, and it was being shown at places like women's institutes and so forth. Any women's group, whether it was a conservative women's group or a sort of more lefty women's group, would be shown this about what pornography actually was, and how it was in itself, it was violence against women, because when you looked at those, when you look as a woman as those images, you feel that it's also being done to you, and that's what, that's how it sort of actually went on. But then, of course, we got the backlash of the feminism, so-called pro-sex feminism. Not that we weren't anti-sex, but they called us anti-sex feminist prudes. And by the end of the 1980s, a lot of that work, that we had managed to achieve things like get that pornographic advertising banned from certainly London transport, had been whittled away in terms of the feminist movement. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
About the violence of sex shops, is that just a bit of an omission there? Obviously no one knows who did that, so it's still going online, so it's just a rumour that I was too young, but I heard about it later, so yeah, I think it deserves a bit of a mention. So I won't take questions now, I'm going to, because I'm just conscious of maybe to get all the sort of ideas and perspectives out there from the panel, and then we'll take questions from this. So I'm going to go on now and ask Jodie, like having talked a little bit about radical feminism, Dworkin, and academia, activism. Obviously, Jodie, your perspective is coming from the women's sector. The women's sector, I would say, was really like the product of the kind of activism, some of the activism that Lynne was talking about, which has then moved into, becoming a service provider, the whole process of professionalisation, etc. So I just wondered what you might have to say about the relationship of the women's sector and feminism, radical feminism and activism at the moment.
Okay. I think one of the things that I was thinking about was actually the difficult climate that we're in terms of actually trying to provide services for women who have experienced male violence, and I think that is really significant in terms of what the culture and what the context is, particularly with commissioning frameworks as they are, to provide services even where you can define that those services are just for women, is really problematic, and gender and sex neutral services are really kind of the done thing now, and it's very difficult to compete in that environment. But I do think that sometimes we can kind of use that as an excuse for actually losing radical feminism even within services that are claiming to be feminist. I think it's quite notable that the national organisations don't take a stance publicly on pornography or prostitution. That really says something when we're talking about academia and sort of radical feminism not being kind of represented in academia. Actually, even in the women's sector, I think for people outside of it, you might assume that that would be somewhere where those things weren't still kind of unspeakable, or that they weren't still debated, and actually that isn't the case, which I think is a crying shame. I think even then within that, within services that are that are more feminist and have kind of radical feminist analysis of pornography and prostitution, we still completely lack any kind of analysis or discussion around heterosexuality or around beauty practices. I was really struck looking at some statistics from our Rape Crisis Service the other day as to how many women had been raped not by their current or ex-partner, but by either their best friend's partner or their partner's best friend, or some kind of relationship where actually it's not the intimate partner man who has committed that act, but actually it's still a man around that woman who is in relation to heterosexual relationships. And yet to have any kind of discussion with young women in prevention work or with adult women in kind of service provision, it's completely absent really. You know, we do, and a lot of it is unavoidable, the way that services are set up and funded. We do really valuable work that saves women's lives, and sometimes that is all that you can do in that moment. But there is then still something where we're selling women short, where we're actually not having any discussions around heterosexuality and around kind of intercourse in the way that, say, Andrea Dworkin, you know, those kind of profound writings of hers. Just because I know we haven't got much time, so just also to think then, because Julie asked me about kind of activism, I was really struck actually when the day of the femicide launch, as Julie has already mentioned, was the same day that there was the 50 Shades of Grey premiere, and obviously some of us were there. But you know, I was in a room with women from the women's sector who had all come along, you know, to listen to obviously Karen's incredibly important work, and actually trying to then get a kind of group of women from that who would go and protest 50 Shades of Grey. There was only one other woman, I think, in that room, and I may be wrong, so I apologise if anyone was there and I'm wrong, who actually came along after that. And I think that kind of, that lack of sort of involvement in activism in the women's sector is, you know, it's a real shame, and it also serves to create that distance between the women that we are working with, who are, you know, service users, and us as professionals. And I think, you know, when you kind of think about the way that, you know, in the 70s and 80s and women's services were set up, we are so far removed from having that kind of, we're all women together, and actually that's why we're involved, and that's, you know, it's a movement, and there's a real lack of that. And as I say, I think that possibly for women outside of the women's sector, that could be quite surprising. I think there's sort of an assumption that we're all kind of together fighting the same things, but actually I've had more than one woman say to me that actually her bit of activism is say working in the women's sector, and I certainly wouldn't in any way want to kind of diminish the work that women do in the sector. But when women then say how I deal with the impacts of this is that I have a really supportive partner and I go to the gym, and then everything else is kind of left at work, I think that you know, it means that we're not building that kind of movement, we're not sort of building that anger, and we're not bringing women together. And I think that also then informs the way that we can provide those services, because we're seeing it as I'm providing support to you, this woman over there that has happened to, and then I'm going home and I'm continuing my life in a normal way. And I certainly, from my understanding, certainly from talking to Lynne and from talking to other women and things that I've read and other women who are still around in the sector, I know that hasn't always been the case. And I do think, and maybe we can talk about this rather than me just going on about it, but I do think that obviously some of that is that some of those women will be involved in online activism. So I think that has maybe also changed things, that younger women coming through are involved in some level of activism. So it's not that they're not kind of doing anything at all, but it's not sort of building a movement, and it's certainly not any kind of direct action. And I would also say that a lot of that then still involves, you know, educating men and prioritising men. I think, you know, even if you just look at everyday sexism, which is, you know, an incredibly valuable tool, and you know, it's really quite shocking to see all of those examples, but the fact that then set in contrast to that, we had to have an everyday allies hashtag to talk about men, you know, those sorts of things really, I think, have a huge effect on what we can provide within the sector, and I think the sort of focus on, you know, individual women need to take care of themselves when they're providing a service really serves to sort of keep us very distant from the very women that we're working with, and recognising that, you know, that we actually are those women ourselves. So.
Hearing you speak there, I think it would be really interesting. We'll hear from Angela first, but I think Angela will raise the same kind of point. For me, it really raises the question, like, what do we mean by activism? Because it seems to me that a lot of what counts as activism now is a very, very, to me, it's important and necessary, but it's far from sufficient. Because does it just mean signing a petition, going on a march, painting a placard, you know, these going on a protest, these kinds of things? What about the kind of era that Lynne was talking about, of a complete transformation of women coming together in groups, doing the, you know, what was termed consciousness raising, actually leaving their boyfriends, leaving their husbands, chucking all the beauty products and the girdles, whatever they had in those days, in the freedom trash can, you know, and actually these total transformations, I see very, very little of that, because if we're saying activism, I think it has got a very narrow meaning now, and I think if we think about action, as in we all act, how do we act in our lives? I don't know, I'm struck really by the difference, or what I would see as the kind of limitations around the kind of conceptualising activism now. So I think on that note, I will turn to a fellow activist in every sense of the word, Angela. And Angela, I know what you're going to talk about there will definitely chime with a lot of what we've heard already, and hopefully lead us into a conversation about that. So.
Yes, I'm going to read rather than speak, if that's okay. And there's a lot of what I'm going to talk about that really reflects on what Claire said, and I really agree with everything that was said so far. I'm going to talk about intercourse. And basically a few years ago I read Intercourse, or rather I tried to read it, and I read the first chapter, which I remember finding really powerful, really insightful, revolting, and again, like every time I read Andrea Dworkin's work, I find it was really radicalizing, and I, you know, was really inspired by the strength of her language as well. And then I started chapter 2, and quite similar to what Claire said, something I've never experienced before. I was reading, but I couldn't get it. Like, I understood every single word, but it made no sense. I didn't know what she was saying. I didn't know what she was talking about, and the language I knew didn't work. And it was really strange. I stopped reading the book. So again, that was also mentioned in the room. It's really interesting, and I just went on, you know, to do other things, and I forgot about it. What I really wanted to say that at the time, and that's my interpretation of it, but at the time I was heterosexual, and intercourse, the act of intercourse was a daily part of my life. I didn't realize it was imposed on me. I also didn't realize I couldn't escape it. And at that time, I had never heard intercourse talked about in terms that were not positive, necessary, or perfectly normal. So for the first time, someone was saying it was neither of that. And at that time, again, I had been living with a male partner for 13 years, and I was pregnant. So I think what has happened on that day is that I wasn't at all in a position to understand the text. First of all, I wasn't ready. It takes some time to accommodate new ideas, especially when they're so shockingly against the mainstream. But also, I was in it, so I was right in the middle of it, and the harm and the danger that Dworkin was describing was my daily life. I had been successfully trained for 35 years to desire and enjoy it, and the harm of intercourse was invisible because it was just too close. So I would say, like every female in patriarchy, you know, I learned to dissociate from the violence, I learned to embrace it, to love it, and find it empowering. One of the quotes that really struck with me in intercourse is, it's impossible to be affirmative about something one refuses to question, and that goes back to what we were saying, are there some topics we're not allowed to
talk about, think about. A few years later, so that's about now, I'm now a lesbian, and I resumed reading the book again. And what I found was that the book is hard to read, indeed. It's quite different from her other books because she usually is really accessible, really clear. She cut through, it's very, very fun, really easy to read. But this book is an oddity because it's not like that. In the book, Dworkin is analyzing the work of male author, one after the other, example after example, and the reader, I did wonder what she was doing, what was the point. And if you read on, you see there's a pattern, and when she's uncovering men truth, so the voice of men in men's work and men's culture, she finds that men themselves are saying the unsayable. Sex is rape. They have said so consistently and for a considerable amount of time. So there's a really good quote here that says, what both man and woman wish to feel in the sexual act is the essential force of the maleness, which expresses itself in a sort of violent and absolute possession of the woman. I think the key word is wish, because remember, it's only rape. If she says no. The idea that the sex is rape is not hers, she uncovers it, and she got really attacked and demonized for that discovery. Men construct this word, they construct gender, masculinity, femininity, what is the normal way for women and men to behave. They construct male sexuality as predatory and violent, and when they do this, they define normal sex as rape. And they also use the word sex and rape interchangeably. They do so blatantly and repeatedly all the time. We women, we're not allowed to even think it, to notice it, or let alone talk about it ever. And instead, we are expected to see sex and rape as two different things, completely different. Rape is being abnormal, defiant, harmful, and sex is normal and positive. And when discussing rape, we're expected to focus on consent. But consent is meaningless for women who are unclear about their boundaries. And in patriarchy, most women are groomed not to have any boundaries at all. I'll go back to 50 Shades of Grey, where it constructs rape and violence against women as romance, and how women have learned to find it normal, sexy, they want it, they want to be invaded, overpowered and tortured, that's the norm. So women are expected to embrace heterosexuality, to love it, to promote it, or else. Again, there's a really big taboo, we can't talk about it. To men, consent is irrelevant because they do not see the difference between sex and rape, or rather, they purposely construct sex as rape. If sex isn't rape in men's view, why are all the campaigners fighting against prostitution and rightfully naming the act done to women in prostitution rape? What would this campaigner be called anti-sex? By the media, by the mainstream, by everyone. Why would punters and pimp call themselves the pro-sex lobby, while what they are selling is and buying is rape? So it's for me, it was a really intense and extremely rich and complex book, and it opens the way to many, many more radical texts to come. Dworkin used really, really strong language, sex is invasion, destruction of the physical privacy, colonization, it's a warfare vocabulary, and she powerfully frames intercourse as war against women, a war that's happening in every woman's lives, in every heterosexual couple, every day. She understands private sex as a political act used to ensure the submission, control, and destruction of women, and intercourse as a duty men, and she refers to them as soldiers, perform to support the institution and their own power in it, and not for their own pleasure. So what she says is the role of the fuck is to control women. One of the really strong points, I think, is she asks if what is harmful is the level of violence or intercourse itself. She basically frames rape, prostitution, BDSM, intercourse as being ultimately different aspects of the same thing, of the same dynamic. Pornography and prostitution being the violent extreme of that spectrum. And the point is that the extreme violence and excesses of intercourse must remain hidden from women, not to expose the real meaning of male dominance, and male dominance being intercourse, and this real meaning is our destruction of women. Patriarchy is under threat if it becomes too visible and too obvious to women, hence it must remain hidden, so intercourse will carry on and women will carry on being controlled. What I thought about it, apart from all that, is that I had a bit of a disagreement and some reserve, and some point I was a bit confused about. And I think that's going back to what you were saying about disagreeing with what you were saying, that philosophy is difficult to read. It's not always difficult to read. I can think of Marine Fry, who's perfectly crystal clear in her approach. There's something that I really wanted to investigate, and I think even if her approach is really interesting, that she would actually say, men say that. I'm not saying that. It's a little bit of, there's a bit of, I don't know, is it a bit shy maybe, compared to what she would usually do? And maybe, you know, I don't know, maybe she knew she would get some backlash, and maybe, you know, that's a reason to feel a little bit nervous about saying these unsayable things. But I find there is something a bit unclear and blurred about that vision in that particular book, where she usually is cut through patriarchist propaganda. She's slightly more reserved, and maybe she's, I think maybe she's not entirely sure what she thinks, and that's why it's not completely clear. There's a few examples of use of neutral gender, gender-neutral language. Like an example that really struck me is people, the experience of fucking change. People find it really surprising to use the word people in a radical feminist publication. What does it mean? Surely it affects men and women differently. That's the whole point of the book. And one of the points is sometimes it is difficult to distinguish between what she finds in the research she's doing and her own opinion. Are they the same? Are they not the same? It's a little bit tricky. It's not very clear there. And I think there is still a certain degree of male identification in Dworkin, and her main reference are male authors. She considers writing like a man as a compliment, living and being married to a man maybe. Some of the factors that slightly, I don't know, that could affect that vision. I think what we understand clearly is easy to enunciate, and maybe the book is a bit hard because, as I said, maybe Dworkin was not quite sure. I have to say I find that work a bit disappointing, where she brilliantly frames sex as rape, sex as violation, sex as invasion, destruction of women, sex as tool of control, sex as harmful to women. She sees all that, but I don't know how she can stop there, and I don't know why she doesn't go to the natural conclusion of her own research and maybe say, maybe we shouldn't engage in sex with men. There is no alternative, and my personal belief is while we are fighting against the horror of male violence and how hard it is, we must keep a vision of an alternative future and be able to imagine other ways of living, of being loved, and of loving and being sexual. And as a lesbian feminist, I've got to ask, where is that alternative in that particular work?
Okay, we've got about 10 minutes, so maybe if you've got a point you want to make, a question, I will take Kate. I'll try and take some women who haven't spoken yet, so Kate, then Jess, Heather, so maybe we won't have time for those two.
Thanks very much. Thank you everyone. That was really, really a feast for me. I've got tremendous respect and solidarity and stuff, and thanks very much for being so clear. I just wanted to say that I think you know, the activism, the angry women and the CR stuff and everything is what made the sayable possible. You know, it made it possible to say this stuff. It made it possible to see the point. It links so clearly, doesn't it, with the activism that you're talking about, the loss of the solidarity and everything that we're seeing, and the sort of coming to consciousness of the enormity of the situation that we're in and the pressure that we face. There are, of course, massive issues around political lesbianism, but I don't think we want to go there right now because we haven't got time to do any of it justice. Really, I think it's better to stick with the pornography and the violence against women at the minute, and just the fact that we need the solidarity. I need women with me in order to read that stuff. I was in Peebo, right, and I couldn't look at the porn. I couldn't cope. I still can't. I can't cope with it. You know, I'm in bits, but I can't deal with it, and I know that. I've got myself, and I think, you know what, it's okay because there's stronger women than me that are here that can. Do you know what I mean? And it's like doing what you can, with who you are and what you've got and stuff. And I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say briefly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, can I just say to that we did, I mean, like pornography, we did read it together.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And we did relate our own experiences to it. So it wasn't this isolating experience that you're just sitting at your computer looking at it all. We read it together as a group and discussed it as a group and related our own experience to it as a group. So it wasn't, what you're saying is important because that's how, I think that's how you build that solidarity, if you like.
And the permission to be angry is really, really important. I think when we did those tours, the permission to be angry about it is really, really important.
Thanks, Kat. I want to bring in as many voices just in this closing minute, so Jess.
I just wanted to pick up on what Jodie was saying about the rise in online activism. And I was just it was just making me think that perhaps people have been it's great that social media exists and what it's doing and everything. But it does worry me a little bit that there's been a sort of decline in women sort of getting together and activism, and where there has been activism, because I was involved in that event for a fair while, and saw it decline. And I think a lot of it was sort of due to the rise in social media, but the other thing was the belief in women that seem to think that activism, and you have to be doing something, you have to be actually sort of arranging some kind of protest and doing something, whereas actually, what about the women getting together, what about speaking, what about debate, what about consciousness raising, and women don't seem to sort of get that. It's really hard. I'm just wondering about, they're interesting, sort of Ruth got a hand up, and Ruth's been very good at getting women together. So I think it's really important to think about that. How are we going to get women together and bring women together, in this climate that we've got now?
Maybe switch off your computer? Dare you?
Heather,
use a trigger word.
And then Ruth,
I think something really important is going on in terms of the silencing of concepts which are useful to us, which Dworkin has brought in, and we've lost that. But we have a really...
Someone agrees with you. Someone's partying in that statement.
I think we have a really strong ethic at the moment, which on the surface is fantastic, and the ethic is about equality. And so this emerged from, this is what the second wave women's movement wanted, but it morphed into the idea of equality rather than women as a sex class, which is what Dworkin is talking about. So with equality, what we get is something like this. It's all, the minute we start talking about the oppressions of women, we have to start talking about the oppressions of men. So I was part of a discussion 3 days ago about the new porn law which is coming, and a helpline has been set up to support people whose images have been put online against their consent. And the minute we began to talk about it, the woman who is the support worker started to talk about the fact that images of men are put online as well. And I knew we were going to have a disagreement immediately when I said, but it's different, there's a particular shaming of images of women online in a way that it's awful that men's images are put online, obviously, and they have a sense of bodily integrity as well. But there's something different about having men putting images of women online. And that was the stopping point. She didn't want to know that. So there was an equality of opportunity within that as well. So the minute we start thinking, I'm going to talk about the trans thing just momentarily, it sounds fabulous. Let's all be very loving and generous to all of our differences, but what actually happens is you even them out so that you can't see the power dynamics. And this is where we need Dworkin, or the concepts that she uses, to come back in and to start talking about class issues as well. And it was class issues which was so, the issue of women as a class was so potent in the 1970s. It is what made us be able to get together and talk about pornography as a group, as something that affected us. as a group. It what enabled anger. So although the language of equality sounds fantastic, it actually numbs people, and I can see how it numbs young people into not being able to conceptualize anything else other than the ethic is let's all be equal to one another.
There's a really good essay in Our Blood on that and how Dworkin explains she's not for equality, she's for liberation. And this reading is reading again and again because it's there.
Sorry, I realised, Leanne, did you have your hand up before?
Yes.
Yeah, so Leanne and then Ruth.
I was just going to say the problem we've got here at this moment is basically that we haven't got any women's center where women can meet, and that is a major issue, I think, that we can't get organized properly because we haven't got women-only spaces where women can meet up.
And why don't we have them? Because where is the will to have them? Where if we want them, we're determined to have them, we would have them. And there was a video just recently. I think it was a Terry Strange video about Mishfest, and she said the fact that it's the last Mishfest this summer is a reflection of where women are putting their energies and where women are prioritising and where, so I think if we want them, we will have them. That's, sorry. Keep sending everyone else to visual, I know. Okay, sorry. Ruth, Vicky, and is there anyone else who hasn't spoken who wants to say anything? Because we're going to have to wrap up very soon. Okay, so Magda there. Okay, so 1, 2, 3. If we can keep it fairly brief, because otherwise we'll be all out of time with the booze arriving.
Yeah, we want wine, surely.
Yeah, exactly. We don't want it getting warm and undrinkable. Yeah, exactly.
A year ago, I would have sort of been sharing, some of the kind of frustration women are voicing about the lack of activism, about women just being online and not getting offline and actually doing some activism. I've kind of changed my mind because I think it's about a process and time. And I take that from one experience in terms of Nottingham. 3 years ago we had no feminism, no feminist groups, no feminist activism. Now 3 years later, we've got 4 feminist groups. 2 of them are run by radical feminists. 3 of them are run by radical feminists. We've got an older lesbian feminist group. One of them's run by a woman who's not a radical feminist but sees porn and prostitution as violence against women. 2 of those groups are not trans-inclusive. 2 of them aren't. We've got a feminist book club, which is pretty liberal, feminist film club. We've got a women's centre, which is very trans-inclusive. We've also got a music venue that in the evening, that at various times is used free by feminist groups that aren't trans-inclusive and for events that aren't trans-inclusive. And there's activism beginning to happen. I just think it's a process and it takes time. And some of those feminist groups that are meeting are much more, they don't call themselves consciousness raising groups, but they are consciousness raising groups. That's what they're doing in reality. I think, talking to other people, I think Nottingham's a bit ahead of the curve in terms of the amount that's happening. But I just think it's a process. It started off in Nottingham with lots of women online in a feminist group, and it's growing from that. I think we've all got a responsibility to help that grow where we live, and to set up feminist groups, set up feminist events, and do activism and bring women together who want to do that. But I feel much more hopeful that I actually think we're just at the beginning of a growing feminist movement, and that if we all do our bit, that women will get off the computer and women will do real life things. So, just a bit of hope there.
I just wanted to ask whether it would be a good idea, although possibly horrific, to actually have pornography screenings where women were actually allowed to discuss honestly with each other how they actually felt about it. Because at the moment we're talking about women being very isolated and not being able to explore what they feel about pornography apart from with the guys that they're with. And it might be helpful to be able to view and talk about what women are you know, we see all these things about women saying that they're watching 40% of porn is watched by women or what have you. I just think it might be helpful for them to actually be able to discuss it.
Yeah, personally, I think it's really crucial, and we need an open debate about that. We never talk about it. What is the effect of porn on women? Going back to what I was saying, you get, you know, you really become that thing, you know, and we are not. In the feminist movement right now, there is not space for this. I really support it.
Just 2 second thing, show Pornland. That's what we've done in Nottingham. Show Pornland as a film, as a women-only thing, and give women space to talk about their real experiences. You know, we need to create those opportunities.
I realised that we're running out of time, but I was wondering if I could go back to your talk, Julia, and ask you a question about where do you envisage this whole porn BDSM thing going, and how do you keep your hope up? Because I was on the train the other day and I saw this poster advertising a film which was basically the follow-up, not the follow-up to 50 Shades, but the next best thing. After
part of that 50 Shades trilogy?
No, a different film with Keanu Reeves. And the poster is showing 2 women between, and a white knife between them, and the face of a man is on the knife. And it actually has a quote from a review which says, it puts 50 Shades to shame.
Yeah, I mean, we are really out of time. I think this raises a really crucial question that we all need to put our heads together to think about, because it just, that's why I really wanted to raise this whole issue of this idea of BDSM, which is really asserting itself very much as a kind of like a right, a sexual minority that is, you know, with the right. And so, yeah, a few kind of closing remarks and thank yous. I would really like to thank our panel. Can we have a big